Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the rough bark of an alien tree, her breathing shallow and controlled. The emergency beacon in her survival pack had been silent for 3 days now, its red light blinking uselessly in the perpetual twilight of Kepler 442b. She was alone on a world that shouldn't exist, where the very air tasted of copper and ozone. The crash had been sudden. One moment she was conducting routine atmospheric readings from the research vessel Endeavour, and the next, she was plummeting through a storm system that her instruments couldn't even classify. The escape pod had saved her life, but it had also stranded her in the middle of what the initial surveys had called uninhabitable wilderness. Those surveys had been wrong about many things. Sarah adjusted the thermal regulator on her environmental suit and checked her supplies again. Water purification tablets, enough for 2 weeks. Emergency rations, maybe 10 days if she was careful. Power cells, 3 days of full environmental protection, maybe 5 if she switched to minimal life support. The mathematics of survival were brutal and simple, but she was human, and humans had survived worse odds. The forest around her defied easy classification. The trees grew in impossible spirals, their bark shifting between deep purple and midnight blue as the twin suns moved across the sky. Some of the vegetation pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed almost like communication. She had documented 17 different species of flora in her first day alone, each one a discovery that would have made her career back on Earth, if she lived to report them. Sarah had been walking for hours, following what might have been a game trail through the dense undergrowth. Her suit's proximity sensors kept pinging with movement that vanished whenever she tried to get a visual confirmation. Something was following her, or maybe several somethings. The thought should have terrified her. But after 3 days of solitude, even potentially hostile company seemed preferable to the crushing isolation. She had always been good with animals. Growing up on the agricultural stations around Mars, she had learned to read the body language of creatures both familiar and strange. Her xenobiology degree had built on that foundation, teaching her to look for patterns in alien behavior that might mirror Terran instincts. It was that training that made her stop walking and really listen to the sounds around her. There it was again. Scratching, not the random scraping of wind through the spiral trees, but something deliberate, rhythmic, almost like Morse code. If Morse code could be desperate and afraid, Sarah followed the sound, moving carefully through the undergrowth. Her suit's audio pickup was excellent, but it took her nearly 20 minutes to triangulate the source. When she found it, her breath caught in her throat. A massive tree had fallen recently, its enormous trunk creating a natural shelter against a rocky outcropping. But it was what was trapped beneath a smaller fallen branch that made her heart race. At first glance, it looked like a wolf pup, but the proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the limbs too long, and when it noticed her approach, the eyes that looked back at her held an intelligence that was distinctly non-canine. The creature was caught by its rear leg, pinned but not crushed. Its fur was a deep silver gray that seemed to absorb and reflect the strange light of the alien suns. When it saw her, it stopped scratching at the wood and went perfectly still, watching her with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. Sarah had seen the preliminary reports on Kepler 442b. No signs of intelligent life, they had said. No complex tool use, no evidence of civilization, just an ecosystem of remarkable complexity but no sapient species. Looking at the creature now, she suspected those reports had missed something crucial. She approached slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. The creature tracked her with its gaze but didn't try to flee or attack. Instead, it made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a purr, a vocalization that seemed designed to communicate distress without aggression. "Hey there," Sarah said softly, knowing the creature couldn't understand her words but hoping her tone would translate. "Let me take a look." The branch pinning the creature was heavy but not impossibly so. Sarah tested her leverage options, then began the careful process of lifting it. Her suit's servos whined with the effort, but slowly the weight came up. The creature immediately pulled its leg free and scrambled backward, favoring the injured limb. For a moment, they looked at each other across a distance of maybe 3 meters. The creature's leg didn't appear to be broken, just bruised and scraped. It could probably survive on its own, given time to heal. Then the creature did something that changed everything. It approached her deliberately, limping but determined, and dropped something at her feet. Sarah looked down and felt her world shift. It was a piece of metal, clearly artificial with markings that were definitely not random. The edges had been deliberately shaped, and there were what looked like tool marks along one side. The creature made that purring whimper sound again and backed away. Watching her expectantly, Sarah picked up the metal fragment and examined it more closely. The markings were systematic, possibly mathematical. The shaping was too precise to be natural, too purposeful to be accidental. This was technology. Primitive, perhaps, but undeniably the product of intelligence, and this creature had brought it to her as a gift. "My God," she whispered, looking back at the creature. "You're not just intelligent. You're trying to communicate." The creature tilted its head at her tone, then made a series of sounds that were clearly deliberate. Not words exactly, but something structured, something that followed rules. A language. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien air. If this creature could use tools, could communicate with complex vocalizations, then the initial surveys had been catastrophically wrong. This world wasn't uninhabited. It was home to a species that humanity had never encountered, never studied, never even acknowledged existed. And now she was stranded here, alone with them. The creature made another sound, softer this time, and Sarah realized that it wasn't backing away anymore. It was settling down near her, close enough to reach but far enough to maintain what felt like polite distance. As the alien suns began to set, painting the spiral trees in shades of deep amber and violet, Sarah found herself with the most unlikely of companions. Tomorrow she would need to continue searching for water and shelter. She would need to figure out how to contact the rescue teams that were surely looking for her. But tonight, for the first time since the crash, she wasn't alone in the wilderness. Sarah woke to the sound of movement and the subtle shift of filtered sunlight through the canopy above. Her environmental suit had maintained life support through the night, but she could feel the drain on her power cells. 2 days of full protection remaining, maybe 3 if she was very careful with the settings. The creature was gone. For a moment, disappointment cut through her more practical concerns. She had spent the evening trying to establish basic communication with what she had started thinking of as the lichen pup, though it was clearly not a juvenile of any Earth species. Their progress had been limited but promising. The creature had responded to her attempts at vocal mimicry with what seemed like approval, and it had demonstrated a remarkable ability to mimic her own sounds in return. But now she was alone again, and survival had to take priority over xenolinguistic breakthroughs. Sarah checked her equipment and started walking, following the natural contours of the land toward what looked like a river valley in the distance. The gravity on Kepler 442b was slightly lighter than Earth standard, which helped with the hiking but played havoc with her balance whenever she tried to move quickly. Everything felt just slightly wrong, from the way water droplets fell from the spiral trees to the arc of her own footsteps. She had been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard it again. The purring whimper sound that was becoming familiar. Sarah turned and saw the lichen pup emerging from behind a cluster of the bioluminescent undergrowth. It was carrying something in its mouth. "You came back," Sarah said, surprised by how relieved she felt. The creature approached and dropped its burden at her feet. This time it was a collection of items. More metal fragments, a cluster of crystalline formations, and what looked like processed fibers woven into a crude but recognizable pattern. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't random objects. They were samples. The creature was showing her examples of its people's technology. Sarah knelt down and examined each item carefully. The metalwork was more sophisticated than the first piece, showing evidence of heat treatment and deliberate alloying. The crystals were natural formations, but they had been cut and shaped with precision that suggested both tools and mathematical understanding. The woven fibers were perhaps the most remarkable of all, because weaving required not just intelligence but cultural transmission of complex skills. "You're trying to prove something to me, aren't you?" Sarah said, looking into those unnaturally intelligent eyes. "You want me to understand that your people are more than the surveys suggested." The creature made a series of sounds that were definitely structured like language. Sarah listened carefully, trying to identify patterns. There were definitely repeated elements, and the tonal variations seemed deliberate rather than emotional. She was listening to actual speech, even if she couldn't understand it. Then the creature did something that made Sarah's scientific training war with her survival instincts. It stood up on its hind legs, balancing expertly despite its injured limb, and gestured toward the river valley with one forepaw. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, clearly communicating direction and intent. It wanted her to follow. Every protocol she had learned about first contact screamed against the idea. Unknown species, unknown territory, unknown intentions. But her water supplies were running low, her power cells were draining, and she was completely alone on an alien world. Sometimes survival meant taking calculated risks. "All right," Sarah said, adjusting her pack. "Lead the way." The lichen pup dropped back to all fours and began moving through the forest with an easy confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity with the terrain. Sarah followed, trying to memorize landmarks in case she needed to retrace her route. The creature moved at a pace that accommodated her slower human gait, occasionally looking back to make sure she was keeping up. As they traveled, Sarah began to notice signs that she had missed during her solo journey. Subtle marks on trees that looked deliberately placed, arrangements of stones that seemed too purposeful to be natural, paths through the undergrowth that showed evidence of regular use. The forest wasn't empty. It was inhabited, managed, shaped by intelligence. The river, when they reached it, was everything she had hoped for. Clear water running over smooth stones with banks that showed no obvious signs of contamination. Sarah's water purification tablets could handle most organic contaminants, and her suit's sensors detected no immediately dangerous chemicals. She could refill her water supplies here, buying herself crucial time. But as she knelt by the riverbank to fill her containers, movement on the far shore caught her attention. More lichens, at least a dozen of them, watching from the edge of the tree line. They were larger than her companion, clearly adults, and their body language suggested wariness rather than aggression. Sarah's companion made a series of vocalizations toward the watching group, and several of them responded in kind. Conversation. Actual conversation, complete with what looked like different voices, different perspectives, even what might have been disagreement. One of the adult lichens separated from the group and approached the water's edge. This one was larger than the others, with darker fur marked by distinctive silver patterns around the face and shoulders. When it spoke, the other lichens listened in a way that suggested authority or respect. The conversation between Sarah's companion and the apparent leader went on for several minutes, complex and nuanced. Sarah found herself wishing desperately for her xenolinguistic software, but that was back on the Endeavor along with the rest of her equipment. Finally, the leader made a decision. It stepped into the shallow water and crossed the river, moving with careful deliberation. Sarah stood slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening. Her companion moved to a position between them, clearly facilitating some kind of introduction. The leader stopped just outside what felt like personal space and began to speak. The vocalizations were slower, more deliberate than normal conversation, clearly intended for Sarah's benefit. Then it did something that nearly made Sarah drop her water containers. It pointed to itself and made a specific sound. Then it pointed to Sarah and waited. Names. It was trying to exchange names. Sarah pointed to herself and said clearly, "Sarah." The leader repeated the sound several times, getting the pronunciation approximately right, then pointed to itself again and repeated its own vocalization. Sarah tried to mimic the sound, a complex combination of tones that her human vocal cords could only approximate. The leader made what could only be described as an approving sound, then gestured toward the forest behind it. Other lichens emerged from the tree line, moving with purpose. They were carrying things, woven containers, tools that gleamed with metal, objects that were clearly artificial and sophisticated. Sarah's companion moved to her side and made soft, reassuring sounds. The injured pup that she had helped was introducing her to its people, vouching for her somehow. The leader gestured toward the deeper forest and made an inquiry sound. Sarah understood the question without needing translation. "Will you come with us?" Every instinct told her that this was either the best decision she could make or the worst. But looking at the collection of technology the lichens had brought, at the clear intelligence in their eyes, at the careful way they were managing this first contact situation, Sarah realized that her survival might depend on accepting their invitation. She looked at her companion, the injured pup who had sought her help and then brought her proof of its people's intelligence. "What do you think?" she asked. "Can I trust them?" The pup moved closer and leaned against her leg, a gesture that felt like reassurance across all species lines. Sarah looked back at the leader and nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'll come with you." The leader made a sound that might have been satisfaction, then turned and began walking into the forest. The other lichens fell into formation around Sarah, not threatening but clearly protective. Her companions stayed close by her side as they moved deeper into territory that no human had ever seen. Sarah was about to become the first human to visit a lichen settlement. The implications for both species were staggering, but for now all that mattered was that she was no longer alone in the wilderness. The lichen settlement defied every expectation Sarah had formed about primitive civilizations. Hidden in a natural canyon where 3 streams converged, the community had been built with an engineering sophistication that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge and refined technique. The dwellings weren't simple shelters but carefully constructed buildings that worked with the natural landscape rather than against it. Some were built into the canyon walls themselves, with carved stone facades that caught and redirected the light of the twin suns. Others were elevated structures that spanned between massive spiral trees, connected by bridges that seemed to flex and sway with the wind while remaining perfectly stable. But it was the workshop areas that truly captured Sarah's attention. Lichens moved between stations where metal was being worked, fibers were being woven, and crystals were being shaped with tools that were clearly sophisticated despite their unfamiliar design. The sound of hammering rang through the canyon, accompanied by the controlled application of what looked like chemical processes for treating materials. Sarah's companion, who she had mentally started calling Scout, led her through the settlement while lichens stopped their work to observe the strange visitor. Their expressions were cautious but curious, and several made soft vocalizations that Scout answered with what seemed like explanations. The leader who had crossed the river, whose name sounded something like Korthak when Sarah tried to pronounce it, guided them to a large central building that was clearly designed for community gatherings. Inside, the space was lit by a combination of bioluminescent cultivation and carefully placed crystal formations that amplified and directed the available light. A group of older lichens was waiting for them, and Sarah realized she was about to participate in something like a formal first contact session. These were clearly the elders or decision-makers of the community, and they had been prepared for her arrival. Korthak began speaking to the assembled group, making gestures towards Sarah and occasionally towards Scout. Sarah caught her own name being repeated, along with sounds that seemed to represent concepts rather than simple words. The discussion went on for several minutes with different elders asking questions and making observations. Finally, one of the elders stood and approached Sarah directly. This lichen was clearly ancient by the standards of the species, with fur that had turned completely silver and eyes that held the depth of long experience. When it spoke, the voice was surprisingly gentle. The elder gestured to a carved stone surface and began drawing in the thin layer of sand that covered it. Simple geometric shapes at first, then more complex patterns. Sarah watched, fascinated, as a mathematical proof took shape in the sand, Pythagorean theorem expressed in base 8 notation. Sarah's hands shook as she knelt beside the stone and added her own marks to the sand. The elder watched intently as Sarah worked through the same proof using base 10 mathematics, then expanded it to show the relationship between different geometric progressions. When she finished, the elder made a sound that was unmistakably delighted. It called out to the other lichens who gathered around to observe the mathematical dialogue taking shape in the sand. Soon, several of them were adding their own contributions, working through problems and proofs with an enthusiasm that transcended species barriers. Mathematics, Sarah realized, was their first true shared language. Over the next several hours, that mathematical foundation allowed them to build more complex forms of communication. Sarah learned that the lichens had their own system of astronomy, remarkably accurate despite being based entirely on naked-eye observation. They had identified the orbital mechanics of their world and its twin suns, and they understood concepts like seasonal variation and tidal effects. But more than that, they had been watching the sky for signs of visitors from other worlds. The elder, whose name Sarah approximated as Grethkor, showed her to another area of the central building, where star charts were carved into the walls. Not just maps of the local stellar environment, but records of observations going back generations, objects that appeared and disappeared on regular schedules, moving lights that followed predictable paths across the sky. They had been tracking human spacecraft for over a standard year. "You knew we were coming," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how much of her verbal communication they understood yet. "You've been watching our ships." Grethkor made confirming sounds and gestured to a particular section of the wall carvings. Sarah could make out what looked like a record of the Endeavor's orbital survey pattern, accurate to a degree that suggested very precise observation and record-keeping. Scout moved to Sarah's side and made a series of vocalizations, then pointed to itself and mimicked what looked like the motion of something falling from the sky. Sarah understood with sudden clarity. "You saw my escape pod crash," she said. "That's how you found me so quickly. You weren't following me randomly, you were looking for me." The implications were staggering. Not only were the Lycans intelligent tool users with a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy, but they had been conducting deliberate observation of human activities. They had known about her crash and had made a conscious decision to initiate contact. Scout's rescue of her hadn't been chance. It had been policy. That evening, the Lycans prepared what was clearly a formal welcoming feast. Sarah's dietary requirements had been carefully considered, and they presented her with foods that her suit's sensors confirmed were safe for human consumption. Fruits from the spiral trees, grains that had been processed into something resembling bread, and protein sources that seemed to be derived from aquatic creatures from the local streams. But the most remarkable aspect of the meal was the ceremony that surrounded it. The Lycans had protocols for welcoming visitors, rituals that suggested they had contemplated contact with other species long before humans had arrived in their system. As the meal progressed, different Lycans approached Sarah with gifts, tools crafted from local materials, samples of their artwork, and small mechanical devices that seemed to serve no purpose other than demonstrating their understanding of leverage, gear ratios, and precision craftsmanship. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was witnessing. This wasn't first contact with a primitive species that humans would need to guide toward civilization. This was first contact between two technological civilizations, one of which had been deliberately preparing for the meeting. Late in the evening, as the community settled down for the night, Grethkor approached Sarah with one final demonstration. The elder led her to an area outside the main settlement where a large crystalline formation had been shaped into what was unmistakably a communications device. The crystals hummed with controlled energy, and when Grethkor manipulated certain elements of the array, Sarah's suit detected electromagnetic emissions on frequencies that were clearly artificial. The Lycans had radio technology, albeit based on principles that were entirely different from human engineering. Grethkor made questioning sounds and gestured toward Sarah's emergency beacon, which she had been carrying in her pack. With growing excitement, Sarah pulled out the device and showed it to the elder. Grethkor examined it carefully, then began making adjustments to the crystal array. Within minutes, Sarah's beacon was connected to the Lycan communication system. The red light that had been blinking uselessly for days suddenly shifted to amber, then green. "Contact established, my God," Sarah whispered. "You're boosting my signal. You're helping me contact my people." But even as relief flooded through her at the prospect of rescue, Sarah realized that everything was about to become vastly more complicated. When human ships arrived to retrieve her, they would find not an uninhabited world suitable for colonization, but a planet that was home to an intelligent civilization that had been watching them from the beginning. First contact was no longer a possibility. It had already happened, and Sarah found herself in the position of being humanity's first and completely unprepared ambassador to an alien species. The Lycans had saved her life, shared their knowledge, and demonstrated a level of cultural sophistication that rivaled human civilization in many respects. Now she had to figure out how to protect them from the inevitable consequences of their generosity. As she lay in the shelter they had prepared for her, listening to the sounds of an alien community settling down for the night, Sarah realized that her survival was no longer the most important challenge she faced. She had to ensure that both species survived what was coming next. Sarah's emergency beacon had been active for 6 hours when the first response came through. The Lycan communication array translated the incoming signal into audible frequencies, and Sarah found herself listening to the voice of Captain Martinez from the rescue ship Perseverance. "Dr. Chen, this is Captain Martinez. We have your signal and are preparing for emergency extraction. Maintain your current position and keep your beacon active." Estimated arrival time is 14 hours. Are you injured? Please respond if you're able. Sarah looked at Grethker, who had been monitoring the transmission with obvious interest. The elder Lycan had demonstrated a remarkable ability to recognize patterns in human speech, and Sarah suspected that Grethkor understood more English than either of them had initially realized. I need to respond, Sarah said, then demonstrated by speaking into her beacon. Captain Martinez, this is Dr. Chen. I am uninjured and in a safe location. However, I must inform you that the preliminary surveys of this world were incorrect. There is intelligent life here, and I am currently in contact with representatives of the local civilization. The silence that followed lasted so long that Sarah began to wonder if the signal had been lost. Finally, Captain Martinez's voice returned, tight with what sounded like carefully controlled panic. Dr. Chen, please confirm your last transmission. Did you say you are in contact with intelligent life? Confirmed, Captain. I am currently in a settlement belonging to a species I am temporarily calling Lycans. They have demonstrated advanced tool use, mathematical understanding, astronomy, and sophisticated communication systems. They have been tracking our presence in this system for over a year. Another long pause then. Dr. Chen, maintain your current position and do not take any actions that might be construed as hostile by the local inhabitants. We are implementing first contact protocols and have sent an emergency message to Colonial Command. Additional ships are en route. Estimated time to full diplomatic mission arrival is 72 hours. Sarah felt her stomach drop. 72 hours for word to reach Colonial Command, for decisions to be made, for a full diplomatic mission to be assembled and dispatched. That meant at least a week before proper first contact protocols could be established. But more importantly, it meant that her individual survival situation had just become a matter of interstellar political significance. Grethkor made questioning sounds, and Sarah realized that the elder had been following her side of the conversation with obvious comprehension. The Lycans weren't just intelligent, they were linguistically gifted in a way that suggested extensive experience with communication across species barriers. Sarah spent the next several hours working with Grethkor and several other Lycans to establish more sophisticated communication protocols. Using the mathematical foundation they had built the previous day, they developed a symbolic system that allowed for more complex concepts to be shared. What Sarah learned over those hours fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation. The Lycans weren't native to Kepler 442b. Their own legends and historical records spoke of their ancestors arriving from another world, fleeing some great catastrophe that had made their original home uninhabitable. They had been refugees, just as humans might become if Earth's environmental problems continued to worsen. But more significantly, they weren't the only refugees who had found their way to this world. Grethkor led Sarah to another section of the settlement, where older ruins were partially excavated and preserved. The architecture was different from current Lycan construction, built by hands that were similar but not identical to the current inhabitants. Carbon dating would be necessary to confirm the timeline, but Sarah estimated that these ruins were perhaps 500 years old. The previous inhabitants of the settlement had been another refugee species, and the Lycans had evidence that suggested at least 3 different intelligent species had found sanctuary on Kepler 442b over the past millennium. A refugee world, Sarah murmured, studying the artifacts that Grethkor showed her. You're not just a civilization, you're a sanctuary civilization. The implications were staggering. If Kepler 442b had somehow become a known destination for species fleeing disasters on their home worlds, then human colonization efforts would be walking into a situation that was far more complex than anyone had imagined. But the Lycans had more to show her. Deep in the canyon, accessible only through a passage that required crawling through natural stone formations, was a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The walls were covered with star charts and records that spanned far more than just the local stellar environment. This was a map of refugee movements across multiple star systems, tracking the arrival and departure of various species over centuries. And according to the records, humans weren't the first technological species to show interest in Kepler 442b as a potential colony world. Grethkor showed her symbols that represented at least 4 other species that had conducted orbital surveys of the planet over the past 2 centuries. Some had departed immediately upon discovering the presence of existing intelligent life. Others had attempted to establish contact, with varying degrees of success. One species, represented by symbols that suggested they were silicon-based rather than carbon-based, had actually maintained diplomatic contact with the Lycans for over 50 years before their own civilization had faced some crisis that ended their interstellar travel capabilities. "You've done this before," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "First contact, I mean. You have protocols experience, established procedures for dealing with visiting species," Grethkor made confirming sounds and gestured to a section of the chamber where what looked like diplomatic agreements were recorded in multiple symbolic systems, treaties or something analogous to them, establishing terms for coexistence, resource sharing, and mutual protection. The Lycans weren't just intelligent. They were experienced galactic diplomats. That evening, Sarah used her beacon to update Captain Martinez on her situation. She tried to convey the complexity of what she was dealing with, but she could hear the skepticism in his voice when he responded. "Dr. Chen, I understand that you believe you are dealing with an advanced civilization, but you must remember that you have been in an extremely stressful survival situation. Human pattern recognition can sometimes create the appearance of intelligence where there are only natural phenomena or simple animal behaviors." Sarah looked around the settlement, at the Lycans working with metal and crystal, at the complex architecture, at the mathematical proof still visible in the sand from her conversations with Grethkor. "Captain, I am sending you visual data through my suit's recording systems. Please review it carefully before you make any assumptions about what I am dealing with here." The data transmission took several minutes, but when it was complete, the silence that followed was even longer than Sarah's previous communications gaps. "My God," Captain Martinez finally said. "Dr. Chen, you are absolutely certain that these beings are not merely exhibiting complex instinctual behaviors?" "Captain, they are more sophisticated than that. They have been conducting interstellar diplomacy for centuries. They have historical records of contact with multiple species, including some that predate human interstellar travel by decades. Dr. Chen, you need to understand what this means for our colonization mission. If this world is already inhabited by an intelligent species, then our entire legal and ethical framework for settlement is compromised. This could reshape human expansion policy across the entire frontier." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. Human colonization efforts were predicated on the assumption that they were expanding into empty territories or displacing only non-intelligent life. The discovery of a sophisticated civilization with established territorial claims would force a complete reevaluation of human expansion philosophy. But as she looked at Scout, who had remained close by her side throughout the day, Sarah realized that there were more immediate concerns than colonial policy. The Lycans had saved her life, shared their knowledge, and demonstrated trust that went far beyond what any reasonable species would show to a complete unknown. They had treated her as a guest and potential ally, despite having every reason to view human orbital surveys as a potential threat to their sanctuary world. Now she had to help both species navigate the complex diplomatic and ethical challenges that were about to unfold, starting with the arrival of Captain Martinez and his crew in less than 8 hours. First contact was about to become a test of whether humans were worthy of the trust the Lycans had shown her. Sarah's emergency beacon had been active for 6 hours when the first response came through. The Lycan communication array translated the incoming signal into audible frequencies, and Sarah found herself listening to the voice of Captain Martinez from the rescue ship Perseverance. "Dr. Chen, this is Captain Martinez. We have your signal and are preparing for emergency extraction. Maintain your current position and keep your beacon active. Estimated arrival time is 14 hours. Are you injured? Please respond if you're able." Sarah looked at Grethkor, who had been monitoring the transmission with obvious interest. The elder Lycan had demonstrated a remarkable ability to recognize patterns in human speech, and Sarah suspected that Grethkor understood more English than either of them had initially realized. "I need to respond," Sarah said, then demonstrated by speaking into her beacon. "Captain Martinez, this is Dr. Chen. I am uninjured and in a safe location. However, I must inform you that the preliminary surveys of this world were incorrect. There is intelligent life here, and I am currently in contact with representatives of the local civilization." The silence that followed lasted so long that Sarah began to wonder if the signal had been lost. Finally, Captain Martinez's voice returned. tight with what sounded like carefully controlled panic. Dr. Chen, please confirm your last transmission. Did you say you are in contact with intelligent life? Confirmed, Captain. I am currently in a settlement belonging to a species I am temporarily calling lichens. They have demonstrated advanced tool use, mathematical understanding, astronomy, and sophisticated communication systems. They have been tracking our presence in this system for over a year. Another long pause then. Dr. Chen, maintain your current position and do not take any actions that might be construed as hostile by the local inhabitants. We are implementing first contact protocols and have sent an emergency message to Colonial Command. Additional ships are en route. Estimated time to full diplomatic mission arrival is 72 hours. Sarah felt her stomach drop. 72 hours for word to reach Colonial Command, for decisions to be made, for a full diplomatic mission to be assembled and dispatched. That meant at least a week before proper first contact protocols could be established. But more importantly, it meant that her individual survival situation had just become a matter of interstellar political significance. Grethkor made questioning sounds, and Sarah realized that the Elder had been following her side of the conversation with obvious comprehension. The lichens weren't just intelligent, they were linguistically gifted in a way that suggested extensive experience with communication across species barriers. Sarah spent the next several hours working with Grethkor and several other lichens to establish more sophisticated communication protocols. Using the mathematical foundation they had built the previous day, they developed a symbolic system that allowed for more complex concepts to be shared. What Sarah learned over those hours fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation. The lichens weren't native to Kepler 442b. Their own legends and historical records spoke of their ancestors arriving from another world, fleeing some great catastrophe that had made their original home uninhabitable. They had been refugees, just as humans might become if Earth's environmental problems continued to worsen. But more significantly, they weren't the only refugees who had found their way to this world. Grethkor led Sarah to another section of the settlement, where older ruins were partially excavated and preserved. The architecture was different from current lichen construction, built by hands that were similar but not identical to the current inhabitants. Carbon dating would be necessary to confirm the timeline, but Sarah estimated that these ruins were perhaps 500 years old. The previous inhabitants of the settlement had been another refugee species, and the lichens had evidence that suggested at least 3 different intelligent species had found sanctuary on Kepler 442b over the past millennium. A refugee world, Sarah murmured, studying the artifacts that Grethkor showed her. You're not just a civilization, you're a sanctuary civilization. The implications were staggering. If Kepler 442b had somehow become a known destination for species fleeing disasters on their home worlds, then human colonization efforts would be walking into a situation that was far more complex than anyone had imagined. But the lichens had more to show her. Deep in the canyon, accessible only through a passage that required crawling through natural stone formations, was a chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The walls were covered with star charts and records that spanned far more than just the local stellar environment. This was a map of refugee movements across multiple star systems, tracking the arrival and departure of various species over centuries. And according to the records, humans weren't the first technological species to show interest in Kepler 442b as a potential colony world. Grethkor showed her symbols that represented at least 4 other species that had conducted orbital surveys of the planet over the past 2 centuries. Some had departed immediately upon discovering the presence of existing intelligent life. Others had attempted to establish contact, with varying degrees of success. One species, represented by symbols that suggested they were silicon-based rather than carbon-based, had actually maintained diplomatic contact with the lichens for over 50 years before their own civilization had faced some crisis that ended their interstellar travel capabilities. You've done this before, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. First contact, I mean. You have protocols experience, established procedures for dealing with visiting species, Grethkor made confirming sounds and gestured to a section of the chamber where what looked like diplomatic agreements were recorded in multiple symbolic systems, treaties or something analogous to them, establishing terms for coexistence, resource sharing, and mutual protection. The lichens weren't just intelligent, They were experienced galactic diplomats. That evening, Sarah used her beacon to update Captain Martinez on her situation. She tried to convey the complexity of what she was dealing with, but she could hear the skepticism in his voice when he responded. Dr. Chen, I understand that you believe you are dealing with an advanced civilization, but you must remember that you have been in an extremely stressful survival situation. Human pattern recognition can sometimes create the appearance of intelligence where there are only natural phenomena or simple animal behaviors. Sarah looked around the settlement, at the lichens working with metal and crystal, at the complex architecture, at the mathematical proof still visible in the sand from her conversations with Grethkor. Captain, I am sending you visual data through my suit's recording systems. Please review it carefully before you make any assumptions about what I am dealing with here. The data transmission took several minutes, but when it was complete, the silence that followed was even longer than Sarah's previous communications gaps. My God, Captain Martinez finally said. Dr. Chen, you are absolutely certain that these beings are not merely exhibiting complex instinctual behaviors? Captain, they are more sophisticated than that. They have been conducting interstellar diplomacy for centuries. They have historical records of contact with multiple species, including some that predate human interstellar travel by decades. Dr. Chen, you need to understand what this means for our colonization mission. If this world is already inhabited by an intelligent species, then our entire legal and ethical framework for settlement is compromised. This could reshape human expansion policy across the entire frontier. Sarah understood exactly what he meant. Human colonization efforts were predicated on the assumption that they were expanding into empty territories or displacing only non-intelligent life. The discovery of a sophisticated civilization with established territorial claims would force a complete reevaluation of human expansion philosophy. But as she looked at Scout, who had remained close by her side throughout the day, Sarah realized that there were more immediate concerns than colonial policy. The lichens had saved her life, shared their knowledge, and demonstrated trust that went far beyond what any reasonable species would show to a complete unknown. They had treated her as a guest and potential ally, despite having every reason to view human orbital surveys as a potential threat to their sanctuary world. Now she had to help both species navigate the complex diplomatic and ethical challenges that were about to unfold, starting with the arrival of Captain Martinez and his crew in less than 8 hours. First contact was about to become a test of whether humans were worthy of the trust the lichens had shown her. The arrival of the Colonial Command diplomatic mission 2 days later confirmed Sarah's worst fears about human nature. Admiral Catherine Reeves emerged from the lead transport ship with an entourage that included not just diplomats and xenobiologists, but also military advisors and what Sarah recognized as colonial assessment specialists, the people whose job it was to evaluate territories for human settlement potential. Admiral Reeves was professional, competent, and absolutely committed to human interests above all other considerations. The formal first contact session took place in the largest gathering space the lichens could provide, but Sarah could see the tension in Grethkor and the other elders as they prepared to meet with what was essentially a human invasion force. 20 ships had arrived in the Kepler 442b system, and while most remained in orbit, the message was clear. Humanity was taking this situation very seriously. Admiral Reeves began the session with formal statements about peaceful intentions and mutual cooperation, but her questions quickly revealed her true priorities. How many lichens were there on the planet? What were their territorial claims? What resources did they consider essential to their survival? How might human settlement be accommodated alongside lichen communities? Sarah found herself serving as translator for increasingly uncomfortable exchanges. The lichens answered honestly and completely, sharing information about their population, their resource needs, and their territorial boundaries. But she could see in Grethkor's body language that the elder understood exactly what kinds of calculations the humans were making. The breaking point came when Admiral Reeves asked about lichen military capabilities. Dr. Chen, the Admiral said, please ask Elder Grethkor whether the lichen civilization has ever engaged in warfare, and what defensive capabilities they might possess. Sarah translated the question, though she dreaded the answer. Grethkor's response was complex and nuanced, involving references to the historical archives and the experiences of previous refugee species. Admiral, Sarah said carefully. Elder Grethkor states that the Lycans have defensive capabilities but prefer diplomatic solutions to conflicts. They have experience in managing territorial disputes between different species, and they have protocols for collective defense in case of external threats. Collective defense? Admiral Reeves leaned forward. Dr. Chen, are the Lycans part of some kind of military alliance with other species? Sarah looked at Grethkor, who was watching the exchange with obvious concern. The elder made a decision and gestured toward the historical archives they had shown to Captain Martinez. What followed was a revelation that changed the entire dynamic of the first contact situation. The Lycans weren't just refugees who had found sanctuary on Kepler 442. They were part of a mutual aid network that connected refugee populations across multiple star systems. Species that had been displaced from their homeworlds by natural disasters, resource depletion, or conflict had established a loose confederation based on shared vulnerability and mutual support. When one member world was threatened, others provided assistance. When a refugee population needed relocation, the network found them sanctuary. When new technologies were developed that could help with survival or adaptation, they were shared freely among all member species. And according to Grethkor's careful explanation, humanity's aggressive expansion into previously surveyed territories had already brought them to the attention of network observers. Admiral Reeves listened to Sarah's translation with visible unease. Dr. Chen, are you telling me that the Lycans have allies who are monitoring human colonial activities? Admiral, I'm telling you that there's an entire galactic community that we never knew existed, and they've been watching us for longer than we've been aware of them. The Lycans are offering us the opportunity to join this community as equals, or at least to coexist peacefully. And if we refuse? Sarah looked at Grethkor, whose expression had become carefully neutral. Admiral, I don't think we want to find out. The next phase of the first contact process involved detailed negotiations about human presence on Kepler 442b. Admiral Reeves wanted to establish a human research station to study Lycan technology and culture. She proposed a limited human settlement that would serve as a diplomatic embassy and trade center. She suggested joint exploration missions to catalog the planet's resources and establish clear territorial boundaries. Grethkor and the Lycan Council listened to these proposals with polite attention, then made a counter-proposal that left the human delegation stunned. The Lycans offered to sponsor humanity's membership in the refugee network. According to Grethkor's explanation, human expansion patterns and resource consumption rates suggested that Earth would eventually face environmental collapse, similar to what had driven other species to seek refugee worlds. When that happened, humanity would need sanctuary planets and technological assistance to ensure species survival. The Lycans were offering to provide both, in exchange for immediate recognition of their territorial sovereignty and human commitment to the network's principles of mutual aid and peaceful coexistence. Admiral Reeves requested a recess to consult with her advisors, and Sarah found herself in the uncomfortable position of serving as an unofficial liaison between the human delegation and the Lycan Council. Dr. Chen, Admiral Reeves said during their private consultation, I need your honest assessment of this situation. Are the Lycans genuinely offering us alliance, or are they attempting some form of diplomatic coercion? Sarah thought about her week in the Lycan settlement, about Scout's friendship, about Grethkor's patience in teaching her their mathematical systems. She thought about the technological demonstrations and the historical archives, about the careful way the Lycans had prepared for first contact, despite having every reason to fear human intentions. Admiral, the Lycans are offering us something that no human political entity has ever achieved. Membership in a stable, peaceful, interstellar community based on mutual aid rather than competition for resources. They're offering us access to technologies and knowledge that could solve problems we haven't even recognized yet. And in exchange? In exchange, they want us to stop viewing the galaxy as territory to be conquered and start viewing it as a community to be joined. Admiral Reeves was quiet for several moments. Dr. Chen, you understand that this would require fundamental changes in human colonial policy. We would have to abandon our expansion plans for dozens of worlds that are already being surveyed. We would have to accept limitations on resource extraction and settlement patterns. We would have to recognize the territorial claims of species we haven't even met yet. Yes, Admiral, we would have to grow up. The final session of the first contact negotiations took place that evening, with the light of Kepler 442b's twin suns casting long shadows across the canyon where the lichen settlement nestled like a jewel of engineering and environmental harmony. Admiral Reeves presented the human response to the lichen proposal, and Sarah found herself translating words that would determine the future relationship between humanity and the galactic community. Elder Grethkor, Admiral Reeves states that humanity is interested in exploring the possibility of alliance with the refugee network, but that such agreements would require approval from Earth's government and extensive negotiations about terms and conditions. Grethkor listened carefully, then responded with what Sarah recognized as formal diplomatic language. Admiral, Sarah translated, Elder Grethkor states that the Lichen Council understands the complexity of human political processes. They are prepared to engage in extended negotiations and to provide human representatives with access to network archives and technology demonstrations. However, they also want to make clear that human actions during the negotiation period will be observed and evaluated by other network members. Admiral Reeves nodded slowly. Dr. Chen, please tell Elder Grethkor that humanity appreciates the Lichen's patience and is committed to approaching these negotiations in good faith. But as Sarah translated the Admiral's words, she noticed Scout moving restlessly near the edge of the gathering. The young Lichen was watching something in the sky, and when Sarah followed its gaze, she saw lights moving among the stars that definitely weren't natural phenomena. Other ships had entered the Kepler 442b system, but they weren't human. The refugee network had decided to observe the first contact negotiations directly, and humanity was about to discover just how much of the galaxy they had never known existed. The arrival of the refugee network fleet transformed the night sky over Kepler 442b into something resembling a cosmic harbor. Ships of at least 6 different design philosophies hung in stable orbit around the planet, their various propulsion signatures creating aurora patterns in the upper atmosphere that painted the canyon settlement in shifting colors of blue, green, and violet. Sarah stood with Admiral Reeves and the human delegation as Grethkor explained what they were witnessing. The Lichen Elder's vocalizations carried an undercurrent of pride as the translation took shape. Admiral, Elder Grethkor states that representatives from 17 different refugee worlds have come to observe humanity's introduction to the network. This level of attention is unprecedented in the network's recorded history. Admiral Reeves watched the lights moving across the sky with visible unease. Dr. Chen, how many ships are we looking at? Sarah conferred with Grethkor, then turned back to the Admiral. Based on Elder Grethkor's count, approximately 60 vessels representing technologies and capabilities that span a range of development levels. Some are more advanced than human technology, others are roughly equivalent to our current capabilities. And they're all here to evaluate us? Grethkor made additional sounds, and Sarah felt her understanding of the situation deepen considerably. Admiral, it's more complex than evaluation. According to Elder Grethkor, the network operates on consensus principles. All member civilizations must agree before a new species can be admitted to full membership. But more importantly, all members must agree that a species represents a potential threat before defensive measures can be authorized. The implications of that statement settled over the human delegation like a cold weight. Admiral Reeves was the first to speak. Dr. Chen, are you saying that if this consensus goes against us, we could find ourselves facing coordinated military action from 17 different civilizations? Sarah looked at Scout, who had remained close by her side throughout the evening's revelations. The young Lichen's body language suggested excitement rather than fear, and Sarah realized that for the Lichens, this gathering represented opportunity rather than threat. Admiral, I think what Elder Grethkor is trying to explain is that humanity is at a crucial decision point. We can join the network as allies and gain access to knowledge, resources, and mutual protection agreements that could ensure human survival for millennia, or we can continue our current expansion policies and eventually find ourselves in conflict with a coalition that has been cooperating successfully for over 1,000 years. The formal first contact session with network representatives began the next morning in a natural amphitheater within the canyon that Sarah had never seen before. The Lichens had carved seating areas into the rock walls, creating a space that could accommodate dozens of different body types and environmental requirements. What Sarah witnessed over the next several hours challenged every assumption she had ever held about alien intelligence and interspecies cooperation. The network representatives included beings that ranged from the silicon-based entities that had maintained diplomatic contact with the lichens for decades to aquatic species that attended via environmental suits filled with what appeared to be liquid methane, to energy pattern beings that existed primarily as controlled electromagnetic fields. But despite their radical biological differences, they shared a common language of mathematics and symbolic logic that allowed for complex philosophical and practical discussions about governance, resource allocation, conflict resolution, and long-term species survival. Sarah found herself serving as humanity's primary interpreter, not because she was uniquely qualified for the role, but because she was the only human who had spent enough time with the lichens to understand their communication protocols. Her week in the settlement had given her insights that no amount of formal, diplomatic training could have provided. The network representatives asked questions that revealed the scope of their knowledge about human civilization. They knew about Earth's environmental problems, about human expansion policies, about the competitive political structures that governed human colonial activities. They had been observing humanity for longer than anyone had suspected, but their questions also revealed something else: genuine concern about human potential for both cooperation and conflict. The energy pattern beings, communicating through controlled electromagnetic fluctuations that Grethcore translated for the lichens, and Scout helped Sarah understand, asked about human artistic and cultural achievements. They wanted to know about music, literature, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. They were trying to evaluate humanity's potential for contributing to network civilization rather than simply consuming resources. The aquatic species asked about human approaches to environmental stewardship and population control. They had experienced their own resource crisis centuries earlier and were concerned about humanity's apparent inability to limit growth within sustainable parameters. The silicon-based entities focused on human technological development patterns, particularly human artificial intelligence research and human approaches to cybernetic integration. Their questions suggested that they were evaluating human potential for achieving technological transcendence without losing essential aspects of biological consciousness. Admiral Reeves handled the interrogation with impressive diplomatic skill, but Sarah could see the strain in her body language as the scope of human ignorance about galactic civilization became increasingly clear. During a break in the formal proceedings, Sarah found herself in conversation with representatives from multiple species through the translation network that the lichens had established. What she learned fundamentally changed her perspective on humanity's place in the galaxy. The refugee network wasn't just a mutual aid society. It was a testing ground for interspecies cooperation on a scale that could eventually encompass galactic civilization. The network members were working together to develop solutions to problems that individual species couldn't solve alone. Energy production that didn't destabilize planetary ecosystems, population dynamics that could remain stable over geological timescales, conflict resolution mechanisms that could prevent interstellar wars. They were building a prototype for galactic governance, and they were offering humanity the opportunity to participate in that experiment. But participation required commitment to principles that would fundamentally challenge human political and economic structures. Network members shared resources freely, maintained population levels within sustainable limits, and prioritized collective survival over individual or species-specific advancement. When the formal sessions resumed, the network representatives presented humanity with what amounted to a choice between two futures. Option 1. Humanity could be admitted to network membership with full access to shared technologies, mutual protection agreements, and collaborative resource development projects. In exchange, human expansion would be limited to worlds that didn't interfere with existing territorial claims. Human resource extraction would be subject to network sustainability guidelines, and human political structures would need to be modified to support cooperative decision-making with alien intelligence. Option 2. Humanity could continue its current expansion policies, but with the understanding that network members would monitor human activities and intervene if human actions threatened network security or violated territorial agreements with network-affiliated civilizations. Admiral Reeves requested time to consult with Earth's government, but the network representatives made clear that they expected a preliminary decision within one standard Earth week. As the formal sessions concluded and the alien ships began to depart, Sarah found herself alone with Scout and Grethkor in the quiet of the Lycan settlement. The weight of what humanity was facing seemed almost overwhelming. "They're asking us to choose between childhood and adulthood," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how much of her meaning would translate. "They're asking us to grow up as a species." Grethkor made soft sounds of what seemed like agreement, then gestured toward the historical archives where records of other species' choices were preserved. Some had chosen cooperation and had flourished beyond their original potential. Others had chosen continued competition and had eventually faced extinction when their resource base collapsed or their aggressive expansion brought them into conflict with powers they couldn't match. Scout pressed against Sarah's leg, offering comfort that transcended species boundaries. The young Lycan had become a bridge between human and alien understanding, demonstrating that cooperation across species lines wasn't just possible, but natural when both sides approached it with openness and trust. Admiral Reeves approached them as the evening settled over the canyon. "Dr. Chen, I need you to understand that this decision isn't just about political policy. It's about fundamental questions of human identity, human autonomy, human destiny. Are we prepared to accept limitations on our growth and development in exchange for security and cooperation?" Sarah looked up at the alien sky, where the lights of departing ships were fading into the star field of a galaxy that was far more complex and populated than humanity had ever imagined. "Admiral, I think the question is whether we're brave enough to discover what humanity could become if we stopped trying to conquer the universe and started trying to understand our place in it." As she spoke, Sarah realized that her own transformation over the past week mirrored the choice facing her species. She had arrived on Kepler 442b as a human scientist studying alien phenomena. She was leaving as an ambassador to a galactic community that offered both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented challenges. The wilderness where she had heard scratching and found a Lycan pup had become the birthplace of humanity's first real chance to join the larger community of intelligent life in the galaxy. Whether her species was wise enough to accept that chance remained to be seen.